All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at eco-leadership. And I know what you're thinking. Eco-leadership, what is that? Like some kind of tree-hugging guru kind of thing? Well, no, not really.
Not quite.
Yeah. It's a little more interesting than that, I think. It's more about like a new way of thinking about leadership, less about that one person at the top calling all the shots and more about a group kind of working together in this really interesting kind of organic way to figure things out. And it's super relevant to like community groups and how they can really make a difference, especially when it comes to tackling those really complicated problems we see at a local level.
Yeah, this is definitely more about we're all in this together and figuring it out as we go. It's not about that top-down, I know what's best, and you just do what I tell you.
Exactly. Exactly.
So for this deep dive, we found this really cool study that was done out in Virginia in the New River Valley. And the researchers looked at different community groups. So, like your local civic groups, social clubs, service organizations, just like those everyday groups that really make a community tick.
Yeah, it's interesting because these groups, they're not necessarily focused on the environment, right? That's not their main thing.
Right.
But they still have this huge potential to create real change in their communities.
Yeah. They're not explicitly environmental groups, but they're doing so much that does end up impacting their local environment.
Totally, yeah.
So to really figure out how these groups work, the researchers use this approach called mixed methods.
Mixed methods. Okay, so, for our listeners who aren't research nerds like we are, can you break down what mixed methods actually means?
Yeah, so basically it means they didn't just use one way to get information. They used surveys to get like hard numbers and stats, the quantitative stuff, which gives you a good overview. But then they also did these really in-depth focus groups, qualitative research where they talk to the people in these groups, to really get their experiences and their perspective.
I see. So like one gives you the big picture and the other kind of zooms in on the details and like the human side of things, right?
Exactly.
And they didn't just like look at those two things separately, did they?
No, they got even fancier than that. They did something called crossover tracks analysis, which is basically like using what they learned from the surveys to ask better questions in the focus groups and vice versa.
That's really smart.
Yeah, it's all about getting the most complete picture possible.
So it's kind of like seeing a problem from like all sides instead of just from one angle.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so for this deep dive then, our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to figure out what the leadership culture is really like in these essential community groups.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be looking at, how connected they feel as teams, how much they're involved in projects that make a difference, and how all of this ties back to this idea of eco-leadership.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a good place to start is with how leadership actually shows up in these groups. So when they did those surveys, the initial findings pointed towards a strong presence of something called transformational leadership, which sounds a little jargony, I know.
Yeah, transformational leadership. Can we break that down a bit? What does that actually look like, in the real world in these groups?
Sure. So there are like a few key ingredients to it. The first one is something called idealized attributes, and that's really about leaders who build trust and respect through, what they do and who they are as people.
So like walking the walk and talking the talk.
Exactly. Then you've got idealized behaviors, things like acting ethically and having a really clear mission, like something everyone in the group understands and can get behind. Then there's individualized consideration, which is all about leaders acting like mentors, supporting each individual member and helping them to, grow and develop their skills.
That's cool. And then the last one.
And finally, you've got inspirational motivation, which is really about having that exciting vision of the future, something that gets everyone pumped up and committed to reaching the group's goals.
So it sounds like it's all about creating this really positive and inspiring environment where people want to get involved and feel good about what they're doing.
Absolutely.
But okay, so did the study actually find that this type of leadership led to, results? Like, did it actually make a difference in what these groups were able to accomplish?
This is where it gets really interesting. The study found that there was actually a statistically significant connection between those idealized attributes, that trust and respect thing, and inspirational motivation, that clear vision, and how much these groups got involved in community projects.
Oh, wow.
So the research is basically saying that when people really trust their leaders and are excited about what they're working towards, they're way more likely to step up and do something to make your community better.
That's a pretty huge takeaway. But numbers can only tell us so much, right? So what did they learn from those focus groups? Those conversations with the actual people in these groups. What kind of insights did that add to the picture of leadership?
Right. So the focus groups really brought those kind of abstract leadership ideas to life. They gave real-world examples. Like when talking about those idealized attributes, one person mentioned how much experience there was in their group and how because of that, anyone could step up and lead confidently. Another person talked about how much passion there was during meetings, how it wasn't just like a boring routine thing.
So it wasn't necessarily about a specific person being the leader, but more about the whole group having the skills and the drive to make things happen.
Yeah, exactly. And then when they talked about individualized consideration, one member said that when they became president, another member basically mentored them, gave them advice and support, but didn't try to control what they did.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it was all about supporting each other's growth, which I think is really important, especially in a volunteer setting.
Yeah.
And for inspirational motivation, well, there was just a lot of optimism about past successes and excitement for future projects. It seemed like people really believed in what they were doing together.
So it sounds like a really positive, nurturing, and encouraging environment.
Yeah, definitely.
But how does all of this connect to, that idea of eco-leadership we started with?
So this is where the focus groups really gave some key insights. People consistently talked about their leadership style as being very informal and respectful of everyone's contributions, which makes sense, right? Like it's a volunteer thing. People are giving their free time.
Of course.
Yeah. And the leadership roles often rotate. So there was a strong feeling that everyone's time and effort was valuable. There wasn't this hierarchy.
Right. So less about I'm the boss and more about we're all in this together.
Exactly. One person even said that their way of resolving disagreements actually worked because they didn't have this strict pecking order. And they talked about how ideas could come from anyone on the committee, showing that shared approach. But one thing the study noted is that the amount of transformational leadership they saw in the surveys and the way eco-leadership was talked about in the focus groups, well, it kind of varied from group to group.
That's interesting. So I guess even though they're all community groups, there's no one-size-fits-all leadership style.
Right. And this is where it gets a little surprising, maybe even challenges some assumptions about how leadership works best. So the group that scored the lowest on that standard transformational leadership measure, they also had the lowest scores for like how much they felt like a cohesive group.
Oh, interesting.
But then when they looked at the detailed stories from the focus groups, this same group actually showed a higher level of eco-leadership.
Whoa. So the groups that seemed the least traditionally led and the least tightly bonded actually had more of this shared leadership going on.
Yeah, which is kind of a head-scratcher, right? Like it makes you wonder about what really makes a group
That's
successful.
sure. It's like the opposite of what you might expect.
Definitely. So let's move on to how the study looked at this idea of group cohesion, which is like that feeling of togetherness, the glue that holds a group together.
Okay, yeah, group cohesion. I mean, it seems like that would be super important for any group that wants to get things done, especially when they have to work together.
Right. It's kind of intuitive, right?
Mhm.
So they use this questionnaire that's been around for a while to measure different aspects of group cohesion. Things like, do people's personal goals line up with the group's goals? How do they make decisions as a group? How good is their communication? Are people sticking around in the group? And do they feel safe being open and honest with each other?
So, are people on the same page? Are they actually friends?
Yeah, exactly. And the idea is that strong cohesion is really important for anything that requires people to interact and coordinate. So what did they find out about how cohesive these Virginia groups were? Well, the focus groups showed that people really wanted to be a part of these organizations. They talked about how they were attracted to the group's mission, how much they enjoyed the friendships and the social stuff. Like they talked about eating together, just hanging out.
That sounds really nice, actually. Just being part of something where you feel like you belong.
Yeah, it seems like that was a big draw. One person even said that being a part of something that was doing so much good in the community was a big reason why they kept coming back to meetings. And another person just straight up said it was fun to be around those people.
Okay, so lots of good vibes and a real sense of belonging. But I think you mentioned that it wasn't all sunshine and roses, right? There was a more complicated side to this cohesion thing, too.
Right. So while people mostly talked about positive stuff, the focus groups also revealed what the researchers called anti-cohesive behaviors.
Yeah.
Basically, there were times when groups had big disagreements that really split them apart and stopped them from getting things done.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense. I mean, any group is going to have some conflict.
Exactly. One person talked about these passionate disagreements that happened where instead of finding a compromise, they ended up just voting on things, which they felt just led to a stalemate because everyone was so stuck in their own position.
I can see how that would happen. So did those questionnaires, the ones they used to measure cohesion, did they show a similar picture?
So this is where it gets a little murky. The numbers from those questionnaires didn't really show any strong connection between the group's overall cohesion scores and the other things they were looking at.
Interesting.
And the range of scores across all the groups, it was actually pretty narrow.
So it wasn't like some groups were super cohesive and others were totally dysfunctional.
Right. And remember that thing about the group with the lowest transformational leadership scores also having the lowest cohesion scores? Well, the connection between those two wasn't really clear-cut either.
So even though people talked a lot about feeling connected, the actual impact of that cohesion, it wasn't super obvious in the numbers.
Right, it's like the glue holding these groups together might be more complicated than we initially thought.
Okay, so we've talked about leadership styles and how connected these groups feel. Now let's get to the real nitty-gritty. Like, what are they actually doing out there in the community? How did they measure their involvement in projects?
So to gauge this, they mainly use something called the Index of Restoration Projects, which is basically a way to measure how much a group is doing in terms of starting and finishing projects that are meant to improve the community. They also got a lot of detail about project involvement from those focus group discussions.
Gotcha. So what did they find? Were these groups actually making a difference?
So the average score on this Index of Restoration Projects was 2.25 out of a possible 10. And to give you some context, the researchers compared this to studies that looked at environmental organizations. In those studies, the highest score was about 18 out of 40 on a similar scale.
Okay, I see.
And the thing is, these community groups in Virginia, their main focus wasn't the environment. So the researchers thought that their level of activity was actually pretty impressive considering that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So even though they weren't specifically environmental groups, they were still doing a lot to help their communities. What kinds of projects were they working on?
Oh, all sorts of things. The focus groups talked about a whole range of social issues that they were tackling, from supporting people with disabilities to fighting food insecurity to working on homelessness to promoting animal welfare to running literacy programs to dealing with poverty to just making their towns better places to live to even running educational programs for young people.
Wow, that's a really wide range of projects.
Yeah, it really showed how involved these groups were in every part of their communities and how they were really responding to the needs of the people around them.
Definitely. And how did people feel about the work they were doing?
The focus groups were just full of positive energy and excitement about these projects. People were clearly proud of what they were doing and super enthusiastic about their plans for the future.
That's great.
Yeah, and they were also really open to new ideas. One person mentioned how a younger member had suggested a new project, and everyone was like, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
That kind of attitude, that willingness to try new things is super important.
Absolutely. If you're not open to new ideas, then you're probably going to get stuck.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's bring this all together. What did they learn about the relationship between leadership, cohesion, and actually getting things done?
Okay, so when they crunched the numbers, they found a small but significant positive correlation between those specific parts of transformational leadership we talked about, the idealized attributes and inspirational motivation, and how much the groups were doing.
Okay, so those things matter.
Yeah, it seems like having leaders who build trust and inspire a shared vision, that really does make a difference in how much a group gets done. But here's a big one. They didn't find any statistically significant connection between a group's overall cohesion and how much they were involved in projects.
Really? So a group could be really close-knit and still not get much done.
Yeah, that's what the numbers suggest, which kind of goes against that common idea that a closed group is automatically going to be more productive. But they did find a correlation between transformational leadership and group cohesion overall. And when they look closer at the different parts of transformational leadership, the connections between those specific parts, like those idealized attributes, inspirational motivation, and even individualized consideration, the mentoring thing, and group cohesion were stronger.
Okay, so even though cohesion itself wasn't directly linked to how much a group was doing in the numbers, it did seem to be related to the kinds of leaders they had. What about eco-leadership, though? Where does that fit into all of this?
Right. So when they looked at how often the ideas of eco-leadership, like shared decision-making and working together, came up alongside the idea of group cohesion in those focus groups, There was a really interesting connection. Actually, eco-leadership and cohesion were mentioned together even more often than eco-leadership and any of those specific transformational leadership things.
So does that mean that shared leadership might actually help groups feel more connected?
It could be, yeah. It suggests that a leadership style where everyone shares responsibility might create a stronger we're in this together feeling
Yeah,
compared to, that traditional top-down leadership.
that makes a lot of sense. Now, I know we also wanted to talk about conflict, which isn't something people usually think of as a good thing.
Right. We often see conflict as something negative, but the researchers wanted to emphasize that it's just a natural part of any group.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. And the qualitative data from those focus groups really showed how those groups dealt with disagreements and how that related to their decision-making process, how they supported each other, and their overall cohesion.
So having arguments didn't necessarily mean that a group was messed up.
Exactly. Sometimes people even felt good about the process of working through those disagreements, even if they didn't change their minds in the end. They felt like it was important to just get everything out in the open and hear each other's perspectives.
That's a really healthy way to look at it.
Yeah. However, the researchers did find that there were times when conflict did lead to bad stuff, like people getting their feelings hurt, less participation, and even people leaving the group.
Yeah.
And this was especially true when the disagreements were about really deep core values that people held.
That makes sense. Like, arguing about the best way to do something is probably easier to work through than arguing about something you fundamentally believe in.
Yeah, totally. But the outline also mentions how shared leadership could help with these conflicts, right?
Right.
So one person talked about how their shared leadership model, where everyone's voice matters, and that idea of individualized consideration, where you respect everyone's needs and opinions, actually made people more willing to have those tough conversations. They felt like hearing different viewpoints, even if it meant meetings went longer to talk everything through, actually brought more balance to their decisions in the end.
So it's about making it safe for people to share their opinions and hopefully finding a way to move forward together. And having a culture of shared leadership and respect seems like it could really help with that.
Absolutely.
We've covered a lot of ground here. Can you sum up, like, what are the main takeaways from this research? What does it all mean?
Sure. This study is really valuable because it took that mixed methods approach and applied it to eco-leadership, which the researchers said has mostly just been a theory up until now. They've given us some real-world examples of how it works in community organizations and how it connects to other important things that happen in groups.
Okay, that's cool. And what about specifically for these groups in Virginia's New River Valley? What were the main things they learned?
Well, first, they found that eco-leadership, especially shared decision-making and responsibility, it was happening in all the groups they studied. Second, there seems to be a real connection between these eco-leadership ideas and how cohesive a group feels. Third, some aspects of transformational leadership, specifically the ability to build trust and inspire people with a shared vision, are positively correlated with how much groups actually do in their communities.
Okay, I'm following.
Fourth, even though the numbers didn't show a strong link between cohesion and how much a group got done, there was a qualitative connection between how much a group wanted to work together and how proud they were of their projects. And lastly, the study showed how important conflict is. When it's handled well, it can be a healthy part of being in a group,
Yeah.
but if it's not managed, it can really mess things up.
That paints a really interesting and nuanced picture of how these community groups work.
Yeah.
But I know the researchers also mentioned that there were some limits to their findings, right?
Yeah, they pointed out that they only looked at 6 organizations and that the people involved were all pretty similar in terms of, their backgrounds and stuff. So they were careful to say that their findings might not apply to all community groups everywhere. But even with those limitations, they thought that the study still provided some really valuable insights.
And what are the bigger implications of this research, like
Sure.
for people who work with community groups or for future research?
Right, so for people who are actually working with community groups, it suggests that it's really important to encourage shared leadership
Mm,
and pay attention to how disagreements are handled within those groups.
that makes sense.
And for researchers, this study really shows that we need to keep exploring eco-leadership and keep using these mixed methods, combining different ways of getting information. The researchers actually suggested a bunch of areas for future research, like figuring out better ways to measure group cohesion, testing if these findings are true in more diverse communities, looking at how we can train leaders to be better at eco-leadership, and figuring out the best strategies for managing conflict in a way that's helpful.
And it seems like the mixed methods approach was really key here, especially when it came to understanding that kind of confusing finding about group cohesion and productivity.
Absolutely. The researchers talked about how using both types of data, the numbers and the in-depth stories from the focus groups, allowed them to really see the whole picture. At first, the numbers didn't show a strong connection between cohesion and productivity,
Mm.
but the focus groups showed that cohesion was super important to people's experiences in these groups. So by looking at both, they were able to understand the whole situation better.
So, this deep dive into the research really gives us a much more sophisticated understanding of leadership, especially in these community organizations. It's not just about having one person in charge or assuming that everyone needs to get along perfectly all the time.
Definitely not. And I think it's super interesting how well this eco-leadership model seems to work, where everyone shares responsibility and leadership kind of comes from whoever's best suited at the moment.
Yeah. And it really underscores that managing conflict in a healthy way isn't about avoiding disagreements altogether. It's about creating an environment where it's safe for people to speak up, even when things get tough, especially when there's already that strong foundation of shared values and commitment to the group's mission.
So as you think about all of this, think about your own experiences in teams or community groups that you're part of. How does leadership work in those settings? What about group cohesion and how conflicts are handled? Can you imagine trying to create a culture where leadership is shared and where people feel comfortable speaking their minds even when there are disagreements? Maybe trying some of these things could lead to even better results and a more rewarding experience for everyone involved. It's definitely something to think about.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for diving into this research with us today.
Of course, it's been a pleasure.
To all our listeners out there, until next time, keep diving.